Rasti, jasla dječjim, rasti i cvijetaj zemljo radnih ljudi i neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada. Mir tvojim lađama napuči i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, u mi strojeva i usijaju žita. Raspiti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Raspiti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Let's go. южных до окраин, южный гор до северных морей. Человек проходит как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. Страна моя родная, слава Богу, я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. За столом никто у нас не лишний, по заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, подвиг и на труд. Страна моя родная, слава ей, слава ей. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. Над страной весенний ветер веет, с каждым днем все радостнее жить. И никто на свете не умеет лучше нас смеяться и любить. Но сурово брови мы насупим, если враг захочет нас сломать. Как небесную родину мы любим, бережем, как ласковую мать. Страна моя родная, слава ей, слава ей. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет.
evening, everybody, and welcome along. It is the 3rd of March 2024, and you join us tonight, and it is, of course, a discussion of the recent speech given to the Russian Federal Assembly by Vladimir Putin, and more broadly a discussion about what this can tell us about the Russian system. So we're going to be getting into all of that as time goes on, but the time has come for me to do the customary appeal for you to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. And before we get into the topic at hand, we will of course go through those of you who are in the comments. So we will do the customary greetings. And Klavek apologizes for not being able to make it tonight. Apology accepted, but not really necessary. I'm sure you'll catch up on it later. This comes in from Rumble, and this is Shadow Hob, who says, have you heard of the US group called the Midwestern Marx Institute? And if so, what's your opinion on them and their views on Marxism? Well, I've actually had Carlos Garrido of Midwestern Marx on the program a couple of times to talk about the anthology of dialectical materialist writings that their institute put out. That was must be about 18 months ago now. And then more recently to talk about his book entitled The Purity Fetish. And I found both conversations to be very enlightening. I found I had a good discussion with Carlos Garrido on both times we spoke. I'll be clear, I mean, the inspiration for taking the project that I was working on in the direction that it's gone in partially came from the work that I saw that Midwestern Marx were doing, and I figured that their approach, which seemed to be non-sectarian and trying to popularize a Marxist analysis in the way that they are, had some merit to it for our own situation here in Britain. So very much something that I've taken a good deal of inspiration from. I won't claim to be well up on all of their theoretical contributions because, quite frankly, I'm not. But I'd say that overall their work is positive, and also I will owe them a debt of thanks because it was through the compilation of writings on dialectical materialism that I first discovered the work of Ilyenkov, who has his centenary this year, being born in 1924, I believe. So yes, I regard them as a positive influence, and I think that the work that they're doing is going to have some serious payoff in terms of the patient approach they're taking to popularizing a Marxist understanding and educating people in the way that they are inside the United States. So, C. Bolt, good evening to you. James Graham, good evening to you. Gonzalo Cabrera, good evening to you. Comrade Ian Foster, how you doing? Jay, good to see you here. Richard Madden, good evening. Otis, who says, hope you're having or have had a great weekend. Pretty damn good. Was over in Liverpool yesterday with the comrades there, making some plans for future operations, shall we say. Red Star Betty, good evening to you. And Raziel, same to you. Someone joining us from down south there. And Red Star Betty says, good evening, comrades from the Union of Socialist Republics of Britain. We've got a name. We've got a name. Now we've got something to work towards. Shadow Hob is on Rumble and is joining us from the out-of-control capitalist hellhole of California, USA. Well, my God. The land of Gavin Newsom. I was last in California in 1997 on a family holiday. I'm not sure that's before, during, or after the out-of-control death spiral began. Maybe Shadow Hob can tell me. But I remember it being a place of freeways, mainly, in terms of my remembrances of Los Angeles. And in terms of my remembrances of San Francisco, it was homeless guys at that stage, considering this is now 27 years ago. There were still guys with, homeless, hungry Vietnam vet signs in front of them. A lot of homeless people, even back then. So it didn't seem to be going particularly well back in the late 90s. But maybe Shadow Hob or fellow residents of the capitalist hellhole of California can update us on when things started getting really bad. Davy Capel, Good evening, comrades from the Republic of Gwynedd. Albert says, working class solidarity, comrades, and I say that right back to you. Comrade, hello, hi. Hello to you. Out there in the People's Democratic Republic of East Anglia, is it? Good evening to Matthew out there in Massachusetts, another place I went in 1997. Try saying Massachusetts after a few pints, says Albert. Well, I don't do drunk on duty, Albert, so someone else will have to try that experiment and report back. Red Star Betty likes the Bee Gees song Massachusetts. Bee Gees, of course, I believe were born just up the road from me in Chorlton in Manchester. Right, we got HM joining us from the liberal hellscape of Brighton. That's my addition there. He didn't put that, but I'm sure he'd agree. Airful been enjoying the musical introduction. Id here from LA representing Infrared. Good to have you with us. Dingo Whitman Baby is here. Good evening to you. Potted Rodents joined us. Jenny, good evening to you. Well, Otis, if you're looking for a great statuary, we'll take some inspiration from the Soviet period. Slava, good to have you with us. Guy, good to have you with us. Peter joins us from the land that is always perfidious, the land of ancient Albion. Luca joins us and asks, what are the main challenges for Russia now and in the near future after the formal victory in Ukraine? Well, that's going to be answered as we go through this particular program tonight. We need an Arthur Scargill monument somewhere. Yeah, we need monuments to working class heroes. Tear down the monuments to ruling class arseholes. Mr. Chopin, who says, top of the afternoon to you from the sunny Midwest. I'm presuming you mean the sunny Midwest of the United States. Well, good to have you here. Grassy Knoll, hello to you. Marius, good to have you with us. Disgusting Act says, wonder if the Floyd riot precedent, lack of enforcement, to get Trump voted out has made major US repression regarding Palestinian freedom protests much more unpalatable for the US ruling class. I would say that I'd say there's two things operating there. First of all, as far as I can tell, and bear in mind I am of course outside of the United States, the protests in the United States are probably annoying the ruling class, but they are not at the stage where they are threatening the interests of US imperialism just yet. Now, in this country, I didn't think that they were threatening the interests of British imperialism, but apparently certain elements in the British ruling class are having a freak out when, especially over the Galloway election. And we can cover the reasons for that later on. But I think the fact that they're not repressing it openly so far is more to do with the fact that I think there's a judgment been made that if they waded in and tried to leather the shit out of people, that it would escalate quite badly and quite rapidly for them. I think they're opting from their point of view, they're opting for the more sensible approach here, which is to let these, they hope, burn themselves out. But I think there's a sea change gone on in certainly you can feel it a little bit in Britain. I can see it just from the coverage in the United States as to how widespread the protests have been and the kind of people who are getting involved in them. I think that this is sort of, I don't want to say like it's the end of US imperialism or anything, but there seems to be an awakening amongst not just the institutional left in the United States. There seems to be a more broad awakening as to the nature of US imperialism. Like I was watching this woman who's I think she was an Air Force veteran talking about her experience lobbying senators, and she was out there doing some protest and some commemoration for Aaron Bushnell when he died there. And she was saying that what she was saying about her experiences was basically like you'd see somebody who was going towards the Marxist-Leninist understanding of imperialism if she wasn't there already. And I wonder how many more are going through that process at the moment. But as to whether there is a crackdown ordered, I don't think they're going to for this stage, and maybe that's also part of the reason why. It might also be part of the reason why they don't want Trump, because Trump might order crackdowns. Like there's plenty of Democrats who'd order crackdowns as well, but I think that at the moment they're just hoping that this passes over, and the ruling class seems to be, or the managers of the state seem to be not wanting to escalate it too much, and are just hoping it goes away. I don't think it will. I think there's been a real change here. Lurtis, who says Dominical greetings. Well, as a man who comes from a family of very lapsed Catholics, I'll send them right back to you. Right. Comrade Hello Hi says, what's your opinion on that fascist arrested recently? Which fascist are you referring to? If you tell me, I'll let you know what my opinion is on it. Dan Lindstrom, good evening to you. Shadow Hob says, in answer to my question about California, same as today, except the vets are now war on terror veterans. Oh, makes sense, I suppose, in a horrific way of decaying US imperialism. Alexander Jones says hello to me. Well, hello to my namesake. Burke says, is there any future for the Workers' Party of Great Britain? What do you make of them? Well, we can cover that I'll make a note of that to come back to it. Chase filling game says, greetings from Texas. Hello to you in the Lone Star State. And when America turns communist, you can keep the flag. It's already got a communist symbol on it. Steve Choate says, Northwest Georgia, USA. Hello to you. Raziel says, if we knew what Wat Tyler looked like, we could have had a statue of him somewhere. Well, Wat Tyler, John Ball, John Lilburn, Gerard Winstanley. I'd keep Cromwell up there, to be honest, but there you go. That might cause some controversy. But, a great English revolutionary for his class. And then you'd be looking at people like the founders of the Chartist movement, A.J. Cook, the miners' union leader of the 1920s, Scargill himself, and various others as well. People like Rejani Palm Dutt of the early Communist Party, Willie Gallagher, all those early communist pioneers in the early to middle part of the 20th century. And of course, we should really have a statue of Stalin in Britain somewhere, given that he as a representative of the great Soviet Union and its leader, were really what saved Britain from invasion and destruction at the hands of the Nazis. So we should aim to have a Stalin statue somewhere in Britain. Maybe on the destroyed remains of the City of London, when we pull it all down and turn it into a green space. Working class is armed in the USA, says Albert. Well, that's certainly correct. Grassy Knoll just simply says Fetterman. I take it you're making a reference to a certain Senator Fetterman, a man apparently controlled by a US imperialist artificial intelligence. Or maybe that's what he was always like. Dan Kavalik is with us. Good to have you with us, Dan. Disgusting Act says, Bushnell's image seems to be everywhere in the Muslim world. I didn't think he'd be so widely adopted as a martyr. Well, that's the power of the internet right there. Nobody would have embraced that, or nobody would really have known as widely about Aaron Bushnell's martyrdom, if you want to put it that way, 25 years ago. But now it's instantly gone all the way around the world, and I think it's caught on because it's always powerful for those on the receiving end of the brute violence of imperialism to see that there are those who reject it. And in Bushnell's case, rejected it in the very ultimate sense of the term. Mr. Chopin says, workers of the world unite. It's a great slogan. What about consumers of the world unite? No, that's too passive and plays into bourgeois propaganda, I think. Workers of the world unite is a better slogan because it doesn't just sound better and sound more romantic, even though it does. It tells us about, why the working class is the future, because the working class and through its labours produces all wealth in the world, and therefore workers of the world unite means literally the creators of wealth in the world unite together regardless of national distinctions to create something new out of your labours in the way that you create all the wealth in the world now. Consumers is a passive word, and I don't think it makes for a good slogan. Oh, Fetterman was waving an Israeli flag at the Air Force woman. Well, Fetterman seems like he was a fucking clown before he had his stroke. And to be honest, him having a stroke hasn't changed his personality, it would seem. He's just as much of a twat now as he was beforehand. Apparently his record as a provincial mayor he's from Pennsylvania, isn't he, Fetterman? His record as a mayor was pretty fucking atrocious. He's always been a recipient of like the largesse of the Zionist organizations in the United States. He's basically just, I mean, Tucker Carlson had a good line about him. He says like Fetterman with the whole jeans short hoodie thing. Yeah, he's a rich guy wearing a costume. He's a rich asshole dressing like what he thinks the working class dress like. He's a cosplayer and a vile imperialist piece of garbage. Best dispatched into the dustbin of history. The one from Patriotic Alternative, who aren't patriots and aren't much of an alternative. I didn't know one of them had been arrested, comrade, so I can't comment on something I don't know about. I'll find out more about it and come back to the question tomorrow. Martin, who joins us from Vienna, is there any book you'd recommend about the French Revolution? Well, the starting point would be, in my mind, Eric Hobsbawm's book, The Age of Revolution, is a very good overview. It's got some great chapters on the French Revolution in that, so that's a good place to start. I wouldn't recommend the book Citizens by Simon Schama. That's an anti-recommendation. Richard, you're posing a big question there. So why don't I take that and email it to me at the email address in the description blurb below the YouTube stream, and I'll add it to the Q&A I'm going to do next weekend. Raziel says, have the statue of Stalin opposite 10 Downing Street. Build it on the remains. I think building it on the remains of the City of London is pretty good. But let's see. We can take a vote on this. Okay, Richard's question about West collapsing. I don't want to give the impression that anything is automatic here. So again, I will address your question, but I think it deserves its own section, really. And I don't have time to address it fully tonight. Didn't some American communists want Chicago to be capital of the USA? Right, okay. I don't know, to be honest. It's certainly that Chicago was I believe, I'm right in saying, the capital of the socialist movement in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So there is that. Right, okay, so we've gone through the customary greetings so far. So I will proceed to the subject in hand. And the subject in hand is, of course, Putin's speech to the Russian Federal Assembly and what it tells us about the Russian system, etc. So the speech that Putin gave last week, he spoke for almost 2.5 hours, I believe. And he sounded in the address when I watched it very on top of his game. He sounded confident in his addressing of the various different economic and social questions he was talking about. And of course we have to bear in mind when examining Putin or anybody else who's giving a big address like this. Putin is, of course, a politician running for office this year. So you have to bear in mind when listening to him that is a factor. However, if you read the speech and go through its policy prescriptions, You would then have to conclude, if you weren't aware of wider debates, that Putin was leading some sort of social democratic government. And certainly his program that he's essentially running on has become more social democratic as time has gone on. But then again, I want you to bear in mind that many politicians run as social democrats, because social democracy is, of course, reform that benefits the working class, being the overwhelming majority in society, is always popular. But Putin does have achievements that he can, of course, talk about that are generated largely by a state interventionist agenda. So that's the things to bear in mind here at the start. I read immediately after reading Putin's essentially 6-year plan for economic development. I compared it to what the Communist Party of the Russian Federation calls its victory plan, and it's basically the same. I mean, there's some elements of difference there, some significant elements of difference, but in a lot of what he's putting forward, he essentially seems to have lifted quite a bit of it from the KPRF. And we'll come to why that is and what it tells us about the role of the KPRF play within the Russian system, and the way that Putin actually takes certain elements of their program and turns them into government policy quite a lot. If you notice also that Karatonov, their presidential candidate, and Zyuganov, their leader, they routinely criticize United Russia, which is the party which Putin is associated with, but isn't formally a member of. So they criticize United Russia all the time, but they don't criticize Putin himself. So I thought that was interesting. Red Star Betty points out that Biden can barely speak for 2.5 minutes. Well, you saw how well Rishi Sunak did trying to get through 10 minutes the other night, and he's 40 odd years younger than Biden. So he can barely hold it together for a 10-minute lie fest outside of Downing Street without quivering and biting his own lips off. So there's several things in the speech that I think it's worth dwelling on. And the speech is quite significant because, of course, it lasted 2.5 hours. Couple of things that I wanted to observe straight away. I've said before that Putin and those who run the system, especially in this later period, the late period Putin, shall we say, their origins as sort of Brezhnevite cadre men from the CPSU really do shine through in a number of occasions. So Putin was thanking the various volunteer organizations and sort of popular patriotic fronts that are in support of him and operate in support of the Russian armed forces. And a lot of that seems there's mass organizations, popular patriotic front organizations, comes in inspiration terms straight from the Soviet period. Putin and United Russia have just sort of repurposed them for their ideological needs. So I thought that was an interesting thing to look at. And the thing he starts off with is he praises, of course, the participants in the special military operation, and he praises their coming through adversity. He talks a fair bit in the speech about the fact that Russia has come through a great deal of adversity. Of course, goes back to the Great Patriotic War. He goes to the challenges of the 1990s, and he says at one point in the speech that it's engineers, workers, soldiers, basically grafters, who are the heroes of Russia, not those who enriched themselves in the 90s, which is interesting because some of those people who enriched themselves in the 90s are people he used to be allied with. But this is the thing about Putin. He's been around such a long time now that the current iteration of what Putinism is, because it's always a rather slippery thing, it has evolved many times over the course of the last 25 years. And we'll come to why that is as we go along. But the current version of Putin is far more social democratic in the old-fashioned sense than the early version of Putin. And that's a reflection of two things, I think, principally. One is the relentless external pressure from US imperialism, which has weakened the comprador bourgeois over the years and strengthened those within the inner circle of the ruling group in Moscow. It strengthened the hand of those who favour a more aggressive forms of state intervention, more comprehensive forms of state economic management, which you can see that they have expanded over the last 10 years, as I've talked about previously. And also it has strengthened the hand of people like those in the KPRF, who are constantly putting forward ideas around state-led investment. And we'll come to more about that later on. And so it's caused the slow weakening and eventual departure from the Putin circle of people like Chubais and other holdovers from the 90s who have now mostly either departed Russia or are keeping their heads down. So this version of Putin is the, shall we say, the Russian social democratic version of Putin. The version of Putin 25 years ago was a lot more on the if not in the sense of being him ever being purely part of the comprador group, but certainly he made a lot more compromises with them a quarter of a century ago than he has to make now. So he begins with an interesting quote about the US, and he goes on to talk about the US at various different points. But I want to read this quote to you because I think it's quite interesting. The so-called West, with its colonial habits, fomenting national conflicts around the world, seeks to do more than just contain our development. They need a dependent, fading, dying space instead of Russia, where you can do whatever you want. In fact, they would like to do to Russia what they have done to many other regions of the world, including Ukraine, to bring discord into our homes, to weaken them from within, but they miscalculated, and this is an absolutely obvious thing today, that they faced the firm position and determination of our multi-ethnic people. And on that he's right. He says that they wanted to do to Russia what they did to Ukraine. Yes, they did. They wanted to have Russia taken over by those who would weaken it. Mr. Navalny, the late and unlamented Mr. Navalny, was their chosen tool for this project. Just as people like the right sector, Azov, the Azov battalion, the Svoboda gang, all those characters from Western Ukraine, but they weren't just from Western Ukraine, but that's where their origins were from, who were long-term projects of US intelligence and British intelligence, going all the way back to the 1930s. The same objective for which they were employed in Ukraine is the same objective which Navalny was employed to do in Russia, which is act the part of the great big patriot, the big fascist guy who's more patriotic than thee, and essentially use him to train wreck the country. Use him to come in and create all kinds of ethnic conflict, restart the Caucasus War, cause secessional movements to break out all the way across Russia in the various different non-European parts of Russia and the non-Christian parts of Russia. And that was Navalny's purpose, to get in and do that, if indeed he was the guy who would end up at the top, or at least open up the possibility of that happening, whilst all the time waving the Russian flag and screaming about the nation, but in actual fact delivering the opposite, which is continually weaken the country, cause it to break up and cause it to implode. That way, of course, the West could strip the carcass of its flesh. And that's the cruel trick that gets played on these, let's just say it, Dumbo fascists, which is that they, in Ukraine, these idiots, these poor fools who got swept along with Azov, right sector, etc., talking about a strong Ukraine and all that stuff, and we're the elves, the Russians are the orcs, and all the other stupid, cringeworthy meme stuff they've been engaging in, thinking that they're building some strong country. The actual fact, they're just doing the opposite. They deindustrialized, divided and destroyed the country, all at the bidding of US imperialism. So this is why I don't refer to the Ukrainian fascists as nationalists in any way. And you can't refer to Navalny as a nationalist either. They're all puppets. They're all puppets of US imperialism, and that's the best way to describe them. They can't be described as nationalists because how is nationalist, if you take the word seriously, if you apply it to them seriously, how's nationalist Ukraine doing? Well, it's owned and controlled by US imperialism and its big companies. Its men and now women in large numbers are being sent to die horrific deaths in the east. It's even if you ended the war now, it's lost what? A fifth of its territory, most of its industrial base. How is any of that nationalistic? It's not. It's puppetry. You have essentially fallen for a bunch of romanticized garbage and delivered the country into the hands of US imperialism. Now, the most nationalistic Ukrainians, in the positive sense of the word, were, of course, the Ukrainian communists all the way through the 20s, 30s, 40s, and right the way up to the 80s. There were communists in Ukraine who promoted the Ukrainian nation within the USSR. But, of course, Gorbachev got rid of the last of those, and then Kravchuk and others destroyed it. But that's what Navalny wanted to do. Well, I don't know what Navalny thought he was actually doing. I think he was taking the money and hoping to get out the other end alive, but that didn't work out for him. But that's what Navalny was going to be employed for. So Putin also talked about the combat capabilities of the Russian strategic nuclear weapons forces, and he reminded everybody listening, and of course including the United States and its allies, or vassals if you prefer, that Russia has the most nuclear warheads and delivery systems, and also new and diverse systems. So he mentioned that the Kinzhal has been used, the Kinzhal hypersonic missile system has been used many times in the special military operation, and the Zircon system, a sea-based hypersonic strike system, that's also apparently been used in the special military operation. He also said that the Poseidon undersea, the torpedo, nuclear torpedo that can cause a giant tidal wave, that's been tested and is ready for action. So maybe that's what he's got in store for us. Who knows? He's clearly issuing a warning there, basically saying that, well, if you want to go down that route, we've got more of these tools of destruction available to us than you have. And if you really want to get involved in that competition, Monsieur Macron, then there won't be much left of France afterwards. So he also mentions that because there was, if you recall, 2 weeks ago, the U.S. Congress got itself into a frenzy about Russia putting weapons in space, etc. And Putin reminds people that there was a draft treaty proposed by Russia to the United States in 2008 that would have governed weapons in space, but Putin says the US never took up the offer at all. And he goes into that and says, look, they were receiving, the Russian government is receiving overtures from the United States to discuss arms control and strategic questions of dialing down tensions in the world, and Putin dismisses it. He says it's demagoguery, and he's right. The way in which when he describes the actions of the United States, he says, well, they've got an election coming up, so they want to look as if they're engaging in some kind of meaningful dialogue, but I don't regard it, and the Russian government doesn't regard it as meaningful. It's trickery. And he outlines, as he has done on many occasions, about how the US has consistently refused to engage in any meaningful way on questions about nuclear arms control, space-based weapon systems, or anything else, because the US reserves the right to break any treaty it signs and to place weapons anywhere it deems fit at any time. So this is an acknowledgement by Putin of reality, and it's good that he is being clear with his view on this, and it's clear that his view on this is now a hell of a lot more realistic than that rat Gorbachev, who just surrendered on every single question and expected to be rewarded. Of course, he was, as was Yeltsin. But Putin's attitude is much more well developed, and he and those around him have clearly come to understand, whether even though they're not saying it in Marxist-Leninist terms, it's clear that they have an understanding now of why the US can't enter into agreements and stick to them, because imperialist powers can't. They'll only enter into an agreement if they're weakened to the point where they have to bargain. But now, not only they are weakened now, but they're also desperate now. The system's in deep crisis, and they need the collapse of Russia or China or both. Hence why they're trying to do both the Ukraine war and the Taiwan war that they want to have. So we move now to discussion of some other things. So he also makes an observation. He says, and this is something I disagreed with. He says the US is trying to trick us and drag us into an arms race, repeating the trick that they succeeded in doing in the 80s with the Soviet Union. Let me remind you that in 81 to 88, the USSR's military expenditures amounted to 13% of its gross national product. Now, Putin's myth-making here, when it comes to whenever he talks about why the USSR collapsed, there's always an element of myth-making involved in it. The USSR did not collapse because of an excessive arms budget. That's not correct. Now, it did create some problems, but it only created those problems because there were so many contradictions that had built up due to failed pro-capitalist economic reforms inside the USSR carried out by the Khrushchev leadership and by senior government officials like Kosygin. And the problems that piled up and caused all the contradictions to mount and ultimately burst open in the 80s came through a much longer 30-year period. And it wasn't due to excessive arms expenditure. That's a myth that comes from the United States, and it's a myth that Putin's repeating. Now, I would say, though, that Putin should be more thankful to the Brezhnev leadership and to a certain extent the short Andropov period, because it is on their military industrial capacity expansion that his success in the special military operation rests. If you look at the ability of the Russians to suddenly mobilize a lot of armor, be it T-62s, T-72s, I think T-65s is another one, and even old T-55s being used as gun emplacements, basically, in their defensive lines. Where did they manage to get all of these older but upgraded tanks from? Well, the answer is the gigantic warehouses of the Soviet Union that were mainly, of course, on the territory of what's now Russia, where because suddenly Russia needed a lot of armor very quickly, they were able to get the T-65, T-72s and old T-55s out, and I think the T-80s as well, that were designed in the late period Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union's military industrial capacity, in terms of its ability to produce these very effective tanks at relatively low costs that could at least match, if not better, anything that the US, the British, the French or the West Germans had. Well, that ability was not completely lost, and the ability to draw on those vast reserves is because of the much denounced in the West, anyway, and by Russian liberals, so-called militarism of Brezhnev. The fact that Putin can say, we have the most extensive nuclear arsenal in the world, that again is thanks to the Brezhnev leadership, principally, with the work done earlier in the Stalin period in terms of the nuclear bomb and the development of various Russian military industrial capacities, and of course the gigantic scientific base of the old USSR. So when Putin starts bad-mouthing that legacy, he should be a bit more careful. It's thanks to that legacy that Russia is still standing at all. So, moving on. He denounces Russophobia of the West, of course, and you would expect him to do that. But he says something interesting in this, and I want to read this quote out. Russophobia, he says, like other ideologies of racism, national superiority and exclusivity, dazzles you, deprives you of your mind, actions of the United States and its satellites actually led to the dismantling of the system of European security. This creates risks for everyone. So it's an interesting way of putting it. But dazzles and deprives you of your mind. Well, that could be something that could be leveled at the late Soviet leadership as well, to be blunt. So he goes on then to talk about more in the economic sense, more in the sense of like his plans for the global economic system, or at least the regional economic system in which Russia is very much integrated. So he starts to talk about the BRICS system, and he makes a couple of interesting, observations and forward projections here. So he points out that in 1992, the G7 nations, so that's the US imperialist bloc basically, US, Canada, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan, the G7. And that's basically the main players in the US imperialist bloc. It's the US plus its various allies / vassals. And he says that in 92 they accounted for 45.7% in global GDP. Now I know that GDP is a bit of a ropey calculation, but these are Putin's figures, so we'll go with them. And now, though, in 2022, the G7 nations only represent 30.3% of global GDP, and the BRICS nations 31.5%. So BRICS outstripping, even in GDP terms, the G7. And I think that is confirmed by, these aren't just Putin's figures, I think like Western figures can confirm that now. He says now, I'll quote directly from the speech again, by 2028 the situation will change even more towards BRICS. We will be at 36.6%. For the G7, the forecast will be for 2028 down to 27.8%. And he says there's no getting away from it. It's objective reality, and it will be so no matter what happens, including in Ukraine. So he then talks about the fact that the Russians are planning to build a global financial architecture, as he puts it, that is free of the interference of the West, and that, of course, is something which has been necessitated by the sanctions regime. So Marx frequently observes when he's writing about the capitalists and their innovations that necessity is the power that often pushes them forward. It's the impetus that pushes them forward when in other situations they might not. And the constant pressure from imperialism, the sanctions regimes, the withdrawal of Russian access to the SWIFT system, the restriction of how much they can use the international banking system that's controlled by the West, all of that has actually forced a level of innovation in the Russian government that wouldn't have been there otherwise, and then it's ended up weakening the most despicable comprador elements the West has previously relied upon. So he goes on to talk about Russian participation in the Eurasian Economic Union, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So there's various different elements to that he's talking about there. He also mentions, and this is something he's mentioned before, a couple of interesting things on the declining fertility rate in Russia. So I want to read this quote to you because it shows that at least he and those who write in the speech for him do have a more subtle understanding of things than like American or British reactionaries on this question. So he says, today Russia and many other countries are facing a decline in fertility. Demographers claim that this challenge is related to global, social, economic, technological, cultural and value changes. Young people get an education, build a career, they establish their lives and postpone the birth of children for later. Obviously, it is not only the economy, but also the qualities in the social sphere. They influence demography, the birth rate, but also to a large extent the life guidelines that are laid down in the family, formed by culture, education and enlightenment. What is important here is the work of all levels of government, civil society, pastors of our traditional religions, etc. So he's getting towards a a more comprehensive understanding of the birth rate question there. So he goes on to announce a series of economic incentives for those families that are having like more than 2 children. Those who are going to be classified as larger and larger families. So basically making it easier for them to get mortgages, giving them mortgages at favourable rates. Now I have things to say about that, but I will cover that later. And also giving big tax breaks to families who have more than 2 children. So that's a series, and also enabling those children to get, I think, free access to university education as well. And because, of course, it's charged for in Russia. It's not as expensive as it is here, but it's still charged for. So he's talking about the fact that it's not just economics which causes the birth rate to drop, and that is true. But of course, he's studiously avoiding the thing that a Marxist would say about this, which is not just a question of increased economic incentives, though the KPRF in their election program make a good point, which is that what the government, the Russian government, is proposing is essentially that they're going to offer more favourable rates on mortgages, but you're still basically going to that involves getting yourself in a considerable amount of debt, even if it's done on more favourable terms under the plan of the Putin government. Whereas the KPRF's program, and I'll just call this up now, for their presidential candidate, they call it the Victory Program, quite correctly makes the point that you shouldn't be paying more than, I believe it's, let me just have a look, more than 10% on your rent and cost of living, keeping a home, basically. So that's they say the family's expenses for housing and communal services should not exceed 10% of family income. And that's taking inspiration from the old Soviet period, and it's exactly right. So the KPRF's program in that sense is better and more developed than what Putin is outlining here. Because what Putin is outlining, it reminded me in some senses of stuff that Orban's done, etc. It's essentially still sticking to a market-driven model. But what it's doing is it's saying that, well, we're going to aid families in being able to access that market-driven model of housing, for instance, more easily. Now, you can say that, well, isn't that a good thing? Well, it's better than nothing. But the private model of house ownership, I would say, under degenerating capitalism, certainly in Britain. And I think it's a problem in Russia as well in terms of, I've seen both the KPRF and the Russian Communist Workers' Party complaining about the amount of mortgage debt, credit card debt that Russian families carry with them. So again, like what Putin's announcing, it sounds positive, but then you have to zoom out and take a much wider view, which is what Putin's saying here is that the state is going to aid families in being able to get on the property ladder and make these investments more. So essentially, we're going to make the mortgage easier for you to get. We're going to make the terms slightly better, but it's still debt which is going to be on you. And this is one of the problems of when it comes to what I would call an unhealthy but very profitable for the capitalists obsession with home ownership that's grown up, which is that, of course, unless you manage to pay off your mortgage, which less and less people are being able to do in the West, certainly. I don't know the full details of Russia, but I trust the various Russian Communist Party's complaints about mortgage debt becoming more and more of a problem in Russia. Well, you don't own the thing that you think you own. You own debt. You own mortgage debt. And you're going to be paying that off for a hell of a long time. Far better to have a system of socialized housing where, as the Communist Party of the Russian Federation demands, you don't pay more than 10% for your rent on it and your living costs. That is a much better system than still borrowing a ton from various different banks, even on more favorable terms. That provides much greater stability than what Putin is doing here, which is essentially a much more watered down version than what the Russian communists are offering. So that's my criticism here. It's like Putin's correctly identifying some of the causes as to why the birth rate has dropped. Of course, he's not mentioning the fact that the birth rate dropped considerably in the 90s and into the 2000s, when there was not just catastrophic poverty, but a catastrophic collapse in what you might call the spiritual realm. A catastrophic collapse in terms of people, whole generations got lost in the most brutal kind of nihilism that Putin and those around him say they want to address, but they're still not prepared to go as far as they should do in addressing it. And that comes back to the question of what kind of control do you have over your work, over your life, over your future, over your workplace, your community, etc. Now, of course, Putin's system, being a Bonapartist one, being one that is still based on the 1993 Yeltsin and Clinton constitution of the Russian Federation, albeit turned to more progressive ends than either of them ever had in mind. Of course, it lacks what the Chinese system does have. And the Chinese system does have, and they've just gone through one of their national people's congresses this last week, even with all the vagaries and the diversions introduced by the revisionist period, the Chinese party and the Chinese state still has a direct connection with the masses on many different levels. There is interaction between the proletariat, the party, and the state that there isn't in Russia. There's that interaction, that role of the masses, even though I would argue it diminished slightly in China, it's still there. It isn't there in Russia. What you have is a Bonapartist system which is trying to implement these things. It has had a good degree of success. But the way in which you, of course, genuinely recover a consistently higher birth rate is not just through, as Putin says himself, it's not just about financial incentives. It's also about all the things that, he doesn't mention the things I'm talking about, or that the communists would talk about, which is that if women are freed from financial burdens, and men as well are freed from financial burdens, and the selection of a partner is now much more down to hooking up with people you're actually attracted to, not somebody you actually are prepared to make a compromise over for the purposes of financial security. If your finances are secured, if your social life is secured, if you are playing an active role in the shaping of the nation and the shaping of your community and workplace, all of that combined together makes for consistently higher birth rates, as is actually shown in the Soviet period. So Putin's incentives here will probably have some effect. There will probably be an uptick in the birth rate, certainly after the conclusion of the Russian special military operation, in fact probably during it as well. The winning of wars tends to do that. But in terms of actually recovering from the terrors of the 1990s, what Putin's proposing doesn't go anything like far enough. Right. So he also talks about reviving healthcare, etc., but not reversing some of the decisions taken in the 90s. I mean, that's the KPRF's critique. They want to return to a fully funded public healthcare system, state-run healthcare system. I think that today in Russia, there is a certain amount which is provided by the state, but I think if you want anything more complex, or if you've got more complex needs, often you have to go private. That's certainly the experience that I've read about there. So he also talks about economic diversification, and he makes some interesting points here. He's talking about the fact that they're reducing actually the amount that they are dependent upon the resource extraction industries for economic growth. So he says now that the growth structure of the economy has been reconfigured so that it's the non-resource industries, so not oil and gas, that he's saying are now responsible for 90% of economic growth. So Things like they've had success in rebuilding certain aspects of the Russian car industry, the Russian machine tool industry. The construction in Russia is undergoing something of a boom, certainly in European Russia. I've seen accounts that it's being done in the regions as well. And one of the things he does emphasize in the speech is the need for a consistent level of development across all the different Russian regions. He is aware of the fact that unless you're developing all the different regions in a common way and in raising up those regions that have got left behind, then it's going to damage the internal stability of the country. So he does recognize that. However, there is still the consistent complaint that investment largely flows towards St. Petersburg and Moscow, and there's still a lot of areas of the country which are left underdeveloped. Since he seems to want to address that, which is a very, of course, sensible move for him to make. So he's also instructing the regions to cancel certain debts that the regional governments are carrying. So that's an interesting move. And he's also talking about a consistent push to lower the poverty rate as well. So seemingly he's taken some inspiration, or at least those writing the speech, and apparently he has a team that works on his speeches. They seem to be taking some inspiration from the Xi Jinping era anti-poverty program in China. He's talking about the need to reduce it. Again, we'll see what happens in practice. A frequent complaint of the Russian communists is that Putin will say all this stuff, but when it comes to being voted on in terms of a budget through the Duma, United Russia doesn't actually vote for the stuff that Putin's talking about. And that they frequently block the very things that the Russian president says he wants to do in his speech. So always be aware that, again, we're dealing with politicians. We're dealing with politicians who are still sat at the top of a capitalist system. And we're dealing with a party in United Russia which is nothing like the Communist Party of China or the Communist Party of Vietnam or the Workers' Party of Korea. This is not something which has extensive links to the masses in a consistent way. In fact, it seems to be a very wildly inconsistent force depending upon which section of it you look at. And a lot of it is just sort of a hiding place for the worst elements of the bourgeois. So we'll see how this develops as to whether an anti-poverty campaign can actually be waged in Russia in a way that is similar to what was done in China. Again, like it's one of the things that politicians do, particularly a politician like Putin, who is, of course, doesn't nominally belong to United Russia. He, as the national leader, can come out and say all these things, but then it's got to be voted on. Then a budget's got to be assigned to it. Then there's got to be debates had in the Duma. And the complaints of the KPRF is frequently that, well, Putin says these things, Vyacheslav Volodin, the leader of United Russia in the Duma, and his friends then don't vote for it. So again, be aware of the game, because there's always one in play. Okay, so he also talks quite rightly, because this is a genuine success of Putin's government. He talks about the fact that the share of imports in the Russian economy has gone consistently down. In 1999, 26% of all goods sold in the Soviet Union, in Russian Federation, were from imports, and that's now been reduced to 19%. 19% of GDP in Russia equivalent is of imports, and he wants to reduce that down to 17% by 2030, by the end of the term that he will presumably win. So in the upcoming presidential election. So the reduction of the Russian debt burden, the reduction of the dependence upon imports, both of those things are genuine achievements of Putin's time in office. And of course, these are big reasons why the US imperialists absolutely despise him so much, because he, as we talked about at the very beginning of his speech, where he was making the entirely correct observation and analysis that the US imperialists basically wanted Russia broken up, destroyed, and emptied of any population. And if you dig into the think tank reports about Russia, and going all the way back again to our old friend Paul Wolfowitz's infamous memo of 1992, you can see that that's exactly what they did want. So he's also talking about a comprehensive growth in the investment in what we might call the means of production in Russia. So he's talking about big capital intensive investment programs in productive industry across the country, which of course will be only positive if it comes off. So again, positive things being said there. We must of course wait and see how it turns out, though it's fair to say that there has been real success at recreating industries such as aircraft manufacturing, such as machine tool manufacturing, of course, building on the legacy of the Soviet Union in terms of military industrial capacity. So there's been real successes there, undoubtedly, over the last few years. And again, he goes back to regional development. Clearly, it's been identified as a concern that he needs to address, because Putin's been, as he's up for election, he's been jumping back and forth across the giant territories of the Russian Federation. He's been having, obviously controlled, but sit-down meetings with various residents, various citizens associations, and has been talking with them. And so clearly the question of the even development of the country and the need for consistently even development across the country is something which he's been informed about, and now he has to reflect this in the speech. So there are a couple of other things to talk about. He's also talking and making commitments on large-scale investment in internal transportation infrastructure, so roads, railways, and the canal network. If you're not familiar with this, the Soviet period did see a large-scale development of internal canals inside the territory of the USSR. And part of this is for military transportation, so it's possible for the Russians to take their Baltic fleet or elements of it and take them through the internal canal system down to the Black Sea. So it is possible for them to redeploy ships across hundreds and hundreds of miles between two different seas through a system of internal canals that were built in the Soviet period. So he's talking about building more canals for internal transportation and shipping. He's talking about revitalizing transport infrastructure across the east as part of linking into trade and investment networks and transportation networks that are integrated into the Eurasian Area Economic Union, and of course the Belt and Road Initiative coming out of China. So those are also interesting elements there. He's also talking about further development of the northern route, which means that they call the shipping route through the North Pole, and he's talking about increased investment in icebreakers there, which of course has been a consistent innovation in Russia, the nuclear-powered icebreakers. So he concludes by making again a couple of interesting points. So he says, quote, towards the end of the speech, "Self-reliance, self-sufficiency and sovereignty must be proved and confirmed every day. It's about ours and our alone responsibility for the present and for the future Russia." So again, a marked contrast to certainly the Putin of the early period, where they were, as he indicates there himself, looking to integrate into the European economy. But of course, as he has reflected, and as he, to be fair to him, owned some of his own mistakes in not just this address, but previous addresses to the Valdai Club and various other big speeches that he's given, where he reflected upon the fact that when he was Prime Minister, he opened up the commercial aircraft sector to competition, and the European and American airline manufacturers killed stone dead the domestic Russian manufacturers who weren't equipped to compete with the Europeans and the Americans. Now that's reversed, and they're of course having to re-engineer and rebuild the capacity that was left behind by the Soviet Union in terms of domestic aircraft production. So certainly there's some more successes on that indeed. So this is very much a speech for an election year. It's very much something that represents a further evolution of the Putin system. Bear in mind what Professor Richard Sakwa says in his work analysing the inner workings of the Putin government, which is that there's always several different groups inside the Kremlin competing for influence, which is why whenever I talk about Putin, I try to convey that when he's saying something, it's not just something that he's pulled off the top of his head. This is a consensus view that he has brought about via his very skillful, it must be said, chairing of all these different elements and pulling them together and coming up with a consensus. And there are those who are, of course, within the circle that Putin operates in, who are more, shall we say, inclined towards a planned economy. There are those still who favour some elements of state control but still want to operate within the market framework. And there were those, until more recently, who were in favour of the much more so-called free market approach. But I think those people have been fairly comprehensively discredited at this stage. You also have the influence of the Chinese system pushing the Russians who believe in some elements, bringing in elements of the Chinese system, it's strengthening their hand in terms of policy making. So, to go back to the question that was addressed earlier, right at the beginning of this stream, I forget who posed it. Yeah, it's Luca's question. What are the main challenges for Russia? Well, the main challenges are that they're still operating in a capitalist framework. They're still trying to make Russian capitalism work, and they're building up problems for themselves the same way, though potentially destabilizing problems for themselves through things like pushing the private sector model of housing in Russia, which will provide temporary wealth and long-term debt. They're still trying to operate in a framework of having private owners run still key parts of the economy, which they're still carrying out privatizations of state assets. So the challenge for Russia is still how to overcome the legacies of the 90s. It's undeniable that the Putin system has delivered improvements. Putin's consistently high level of popularity is genuine because he was in charge when they managed to get over certain of the most heinous elements of the 1990s. So the question is like, well, what are the challenges? Well, they can win the special military operation. As I've said before, I think it'll end with an unofficial acknowledgement by the U.S. imperialism, that they've essentially lost, and the acknowledgement of that will take the form of them recognizing that the Lvov rump state as the one and true and permanent Ukraine, etc. So there's that to bear in mind. So they will win the special military operation. I've no doubt about that. But as to whether they're going to be able to achieve all the things he's talking about here, like a revival of the birth rate, addressing of damaging social problems which still exist, such as alcoholism and addictions, which of course are probably less bad now in Russia than they are in certain areas of the United States. As to whether the economic growth that Putin's talking about can be achieved, well, in my view, to actually fully exploit the victory that will come, or to fully secure the victory that will come, and to fully defeat US imperialism, well, the only force that's going to be able to do that is a revived Russian proletariat. And this is where, of course, you get the differences between the approach of like the Russian Communist Workers' Party under Viktor Chulkin and the KPRF under Zyuganov. Zyuganov and the KPRF are, of course, an institutional opposition, and through that they have obviously exercised a certain amount of influence. But their view on things is that they can sort of administratively move back towards socialism. I tend more towards the RCWP's view of things, which is that the Russian socialism can only be reborn with a rebirth in the militancy of the Russian working class. And I think that's coming. I think that's coming because what you're seeing now with this is that now you're seeing an undoubted level of industrial investment and development, a strengthening of the bargaining position of the Russian proletariat, and the fact that the Russian bourgeois have been, relatively speaking, weakened. Certainly the most heinous comprador elements have been weakened. And certainly now you have the president, again, regardless of whether his words are backed up by the actions of United Russia in the Duma, going on TV and saying that the real builders of the country are workers and soldiers, which is a line that could have been taken straight from certainly from the KPRF or even the RCWP. So again, you've got now the highest state official, the head of state himself, basically saying that the people who made their money in the 90s are all parasites and the real heroes of the country are workers and soldiers. That'll have an effect. And what you're going to see, I think, is that the level of, there's always a certain level of class struggle going on in Russia. It's just hard to track it because nobody really pays much attention to it, not even the regime change merchants, because they're not interested in it either. So with an uptick in class struggle in the 1990s, in the 2000s, up to today, you'll see a further upturn in the class struggle after the victory in the special military operation. And at that point, you'll start to see the Putin system, and it's not just the system including that which surrounds Putin, it's also the wider political system, which includes the sort of institutional opposition of the KPRF. That'll start to get stretched. And the question is, can we see, we must see, indeed, a revival of Russian Marxism outside of the rather, shall we say, sterile atmosphere of the KPRF, which, even though it does a lot of good in terms of advocating for the correct historical memory of Stalin and the achievements of the Soviet Union, it doesn't seem to, if the criticisms of the RCWP are correct, do a lot to actually organize workers and inspire and recruit new generations of worker militants. The RCWP and some of the smaller communist organizations, all of whom, by the way, backed the special military operation. So like the smaller Workers' Party of Russia, led in part by Popov and others, seem to be doing this as well. And what they are correct about is that the revival of the Russian working class as a class, not just a class in itself, but a class for itself, and then a class which is developing new, shall we say, organic intellectuals of the working class. All of that's important in terms of a future development of Russia towards socialism, because I think the Putin system is based on a sort of permanently, constantly moving, but always sort of balanced or seeking to be balanced equilibrium between the interests of certain elements of Russian capitalism, the interests of the working class as filtered rather imperfectly through the KPRF, and this shifting equilibrium that Putin has brought about can't really last forever. There will need to be a development definitively towards socialism if Russia is to build on the successes. So the challenge is essentially the revival of socialism in Russia, because also Russia, if it's going to redevelop, if it's going to capitalize on the positive things that have been done, if it's going to solve the birth rate issue, needs to look back at, again, as the Russian communists rightly say, the good examples of the Soviet period, but it also needs to have the proletariat convinced of and actually playing the role as the masters of society again, as it did back under the Stalin era. That's what will the security that comes from that, but also the knowledge that you are working to create a country that will be yours and your children's. That's the biggest thing which will secure an upturn in the birth rate. The measures to essentially support family participation in the market model is better than nothing, but it's not what's going to actually secure this. And the KPRF are completely right in their criticism upon that. So the question then comes, well, what happens when Putin finally does go? Because he's not getting any younger, of course, and this is most likely to be his last term. Can any other politician carry on the skillful way that he has managed this system over the last 25 years? At the moment, it's doubtful. Nobody else seems to be emerging, but we will see as time goes on. That's why, of course, the hope of Russia for the future is the re-emergence of the Russian proletariat as a dynamic and revolutionary class. That's where the hope for the future for all of us lies, in fact, in every nation. Right. Okay. Let's catch up with other points that have been made. Fenrir says communism will win. Entirely correct. But let's never be complacent about that. Every single thing, every single advance we will make will be taken in the teeth of opposition from our class enemies, as our beloved alleged Prime Minister said the other night. So, Albert says, free market my ass, always bailed out by the taxpayer. Well, it's only free for the ruling class, Albert. It's not free for you and me. Jeremy says, I have trouble understanding the desire for a higher birth rate. I don't see this as liberating for women. Well, a continuation of the human race, Jeremy, is a liberating thing. Look, I've already answered this to a point, but I think that the anti-natalism that's grown up in the West is like product of decaying societies. Like, people don't want to have children in this, or can't have them, because they're financially punished for doing so. I think most people, men and women, do want to actually raise families. They just find that they're punished financially for doing it to such a great degree that many don't want to do it. And I don't see having children as being necessarily a punishment or a negative thing for women. Socialist countries have proven that it's not. I mean, even capitalist academics, bourgeois academics, have had to acknowledge that the childcare systems in the former Soviet Union and the old DDR were so good that they enable women to have relatively large families and not suffer in terms of development of their own skills in their employment or anything like that, and that this was a system that enabled women to have families and have a career at the same time. And there's no reason why having children should land you in gigantic amounts of debt and unable to do anything but just about scrape by. That's why it's come to be associated with being a punishment, because capitalism has made it a punishment. We need the Soviet Union back. Well, it will be recreated. There'll be a new version of it at some point very soon. Raziel says, mass migration for work is bad for workers in this capitalist system. Well, mass migration drains countries of their most energetic and talented workers. Just look at what's happened to the Baltic states. It's not just that the birth rates collapse, it's that all the most, shall we say, talented people, the most energetic layers in the workforce, they're all forced to go overseas, and that's quite deliberately fostered on behalf of the ruling class, because if those people stayed, the Baltic poodles of US imperialism might be chased out of power. But the immigration in the EU has been used as a pressure release valve. You take the new generation of the working class and you send them to Germany, or you send them to France, or you send them to Britain to earn money and send remittances back home. And of course, that's good for the capitalist classes of the big imperialist nations, and the ruling classes of the vassal states in the east get rid of potentially troublesome workers. Russia trusted the Wall Street vultures, says Grassino. Well, I don't think it's fair to say that Russia as a country did. Remember, the Russian proletariat never wanted any of this. They were betrayed by people at the top of the Communist Party, like Gorbachev and Yeltsin, who did go with the Wall Street vultures and were very well rewarded as a result. Marius says, Putin is an exceptionally talented Bonapartist leader. Very true. I think that in his absence, the communists will have an opening to make a bid for power. They will. They will have to sort themselves out beforehand, though. From the divisions between the RCW and the KPRF, and the rather, I would say, sterile and bureaucratic approach to the KPRF will need to be significantly shaken up. Same is true for the communists in Belarus as well. Again, they've achieved certain things in their sort of broad coalition with Lukashenko, but to actually go forward, they'll need to regenerate themselves again, as every body is going to need to, as we are in the process of doing here ourselves, coming out of this long, dark night of reaction that we've been in. Medvedev might be a good replacement. He's not as green as he was the first time round. Well, who knows? Maybe he'll be. He's now currently chief of. He's currently the man in charge of issuing the best Twitter burns in various different languages. So we'll see if he comes back into the presidency. Interesting to see if he's as good a manager of all the different elements as Putin is, though. Thomas says, Rishi Sunak trying to turn the working class against each other, then sending his thugs in to lock them up. Classic. If you haven't watched the reaction show I did to Sunak's pathetic speech the other night, be sure to do so. Thomas says, I heard Israel will invade Lebanon by the start of summer. I keep hearing that, but I don't think it will end up happening, to be completely honest. I think that what will end up happening is that they will make loads of threats. They will bomb southern Lebanon, but they won't go in. And I don't think they'll go in because I think they'd lose. So I think the current fragile equilibrium will carry on. Basically, we're waiting to see if they escalate on with Lebanon, if they try and launch an invasion, then they will lose and the Israeli regime will disintegrate. That's why I think the Americans are telling them not to do it. As to whether that appeal will be listened to, we will have to see. I will consider that more in a future episode later on this week, Thomas. If you want to repeat the question in a future episode, I'm happy to address it in more detail. Darth Radius says, wouldn't you agree that a liberal capitalist environment is better than a fascist capitalist environment, i.e. Putin's Russia? Well, Putin's Russia isn't fascist, for a start. Okay, you then go on to say, Mr. Radius, that we can at least organise and spread our propaganda without the fear of being jailed. That's not true. My own comrades get locked up on demonstrations, then their houses get raided at 3 a.m. just for criticising Israel accurately. So what you're saying isn't true. Look at what happens to Julian Assange. Look at what happens to various other political prisoners. Look at what would happen to Edward Snowden. And you can't organise without fear of being jailed here. By the way, if you go through, if you push against the British system, as Rishi Sunak made very, very clear the other day, if you push them too far and actually threaten their interests, then you will be, you'll feel the boot of the state on your neck. You then ask, am I in jail? Well, no, and I'm not in jail for precisely one reason, Mr. Radius. It's because I'm speaking to a small audience. Free speech exists in capitalist societies as long as you don't have a mass audience. They're prepared to let you say whatever you like as long as you're not actually mattering. And I'm under absolutely no illusions here. I'm only allowed to do this because I'm speaking to like 100 odd people. Were I speaking to 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 with a Marxist-Leninist message and people were starting to organise and the working class were picking it up in a major way, then this channel will be shut down. But I repeat the point to you, you can't organise freely in this society. And if you think that you can, then you've clearly never run into the forces of the state in this society. You can't organise freely inside the United States in a way that they see as threatening their interests. You can't. And by the way, there's plenty of parties that organise inside the Russian Federation and criticise Putin all the time. Now, some, like Sergei Udaltsov and Strelkov, are locked up. So others aren't, though. And I would never claim that Putin's period in office and the Russia of today is something that I would aspire towards. I think it's a progressive system compared to where Russia was going, and it's certainly achieved many different things. But your attempted defense of so-called liberal democracy is beginning to remind me of Rishi Sunak. And as for the fascist tendencies in this country and in the United States, which you are ignoring, fascism grows out of imperialism, and it especially grows out of decaying imperialism, which is all around us now. So, quite frankly, you're a tedious fucking arsehole, and I'm bored of answering your ridiculous questions. So, question answered. Now, kindly fuck off. Right, moving on. So, now we've disposed of Paul Mason, who seems to have come into the chat. We will continue. Slava says, having children even in these hard times is a rewarding experience. I imagine it is, because raising a family is one of the most meaningful things you can actually do. Mallard says, can you see British and Russian relations ever healing in the future? Only after the current ruling class in Britain is removed from power. That would be the only thing that would do it. This ruling class, absolutely hopeless. It's not. They're not going to be able to repair relations with the Russians or the Chinese. The only way we repair relations with either of them and build new relationships, if in the world, is if this current ruling class is chucked out. And given how fragile they look these days, we might be closer to it than we imagined. Alexander Dugin's ideas are incompatible with Marxism, says Thomas. Anyone calling themselves Marxist while promoting Dugin aren't Marxist. Well, Dugin is an idealist. Dugin, I find his work interesting, but I disagree with gigantic portions of it. I disagree with his interpretations of Hegel. I think one day soon I'm going to respond to his work called entitled The Fourth Political Theory, which I think is vague and all over the place. Right. Martin says, if you're interested in fascist tendencies in Western liberalism, Google Cop City, Atlanta, Rico. Yes, very good point. We have a contained opposition in the United States, says Potted Rodent. Very true. Grassy Knoll says, George Galloway said today that Sunak threatened him and his family. Well, Sunak threatened a lot of people in his ridiculous address the other day. Basically said, if you don't behave, we're going to ban demonstrations, which again, they've always had the power to do. Most of the time, they just don't use it because they prefer to take the angle of letting protests burn themselves out. But now the system's in crisis, we're really seeing the mask very much come off. Birdstar Betty says that our friend Mr. Radius might have been the GCHQ guy spamming the chat. Well, I hope there is some GCHQ people watching. You may learn something. Sunak is a thug, says Thomas. No, Sunak's not. A thug would imply that he's some kind of tough guy. He's an accountant. What's the line from Apocalypse Now that Marlon Brando says to Martin Sheen? You're an errand boy sent by grocery clerks to collect a bill. Well, Rishi Sunak is the ruling class's errand boy, nothing more. Right. So, following in from the Dugin questions, any good interpretation of Hegel that you would recommend? Good question. I would, to be fair, and I wouldn't usually recommend him, but the grand old fraud of Ljubljana, Slavoj Zizek's book on Hegel isn't actually that bad. It's a bit dense and a bit hard to get into, but it's actually not that bad. I mean, I learned quite a bit about Hegel from reading Zizek before he became completely unbearable, to be honest. In terms of other interpretations of Hegel, I'm currently getting through some useful stuff from Professor Popov of the Russian Workers' Party. If the translation seems decent, I will post it up on the Telegram group for you to look over. Let me take away your question and think more about it, because decent interpretations of Hegel probably are needed, given it's a difficult thing to get into. Right. I will come back on that. Mr. Chopin says, any thoughts on the power and influence of the institutions of the City of London? It somehow reminds me of the Vatican, which I believe is considered a society state. Well, I would say that if you want my thoughts on that, I'm going to have to do a whole program on it, because there's a lot to say. Look, the City of London is where a lot of the actual power of the ruling class in Britain lies. That's why they picked a banker and one of their number to be Conservative Party leader and Prime Minister here. So the question as to what role it plays is an interesting one. So tell you what, Mr. Chopin, email me that question and I'll come back to it in a future episode, because it merits a long discussion, which I don't have time for tonight. Thoughts on the World Youth Festival in Sochi, Russia, that's happening now, asks Battle Cossack. Seems a positive thing. I know some comrades who have gone there. Seems like they're having a good time there. I am, of course, far too ancient to go, but I never particularly enjoyed being young anyway, so it's all good. But I see it as a positive thing. Certainly, it's an opportunity for a lot of Communist Party comrades of various different Communist parties to meet up and interact with each other. So I think overall it's a good thing. I'll wait to I think some of my own comrades are there, so I'll wait before I'd offer a definitive comment on it for them to return and report back. Luca asks or says it'll be interesting to explore the relationship between Hegel and Marx in a future episode. Good point. I'll put a bookmark in that one to come back to it. Okay, so Richard says, I'm hoping that the turnout at the next general election will be much lower than 2019. The establishment will be hit with a legitimacy crisis. Well, I'm hoping that the next general election in Britain delivers a hung parliament or something close to it. We do not need a so-called strong government led by Sir Keir Starmer. Because if there's a man who's going to be able to actually carry off banning demonstrations, it's not Rishi and his fading, flailing government. It'd be a quote-unquote strong government, i.e. one with a majority of over 50, led by Keir Starmer. Yeah, he'd definitely ban demonstrations, and he'd definitely ban more political organisations than the Tories, because, again, he'd have large elements of the trade union bureaucracy backing him. So Keir Starmer, in my view, is the more effective reactionary than Rishi Sunak, and as a consequence of that, we must agitate to make as many people aware of as possible that the proper outcome should be the outcome that's most positive for us is a much diminished government, a government that isn't strong, a government that can't carry out a reactionary policy, one that can be pressured more easily by the masses. That's what we need. We don't need a quote-unquote strong government led by either party. Okay, so I am going to call things to a close for this evening. Thank you to the 115 of you who are watching live. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't already. I'm excited to announce that we've got a couple of film reviews coming up this week. So at a certain point this week on Patreon there'll be a review of RoboCop 1987, but we'll I'll also have reviews of the Dune movies. So the two Denis Villeneuve versions with the human celery stick Timothée Chalamet in the lead role, and a review of the 1984 version done by the great David Lynch. So going to be doing those at some point this week. So keep an eye on the Patreon page for those. But until then, thank you to everybody who has tuned in tonight and has contributed to what is always a very interesting discussion in the chat. Thank you to all of those who have contributed, and I'll be back with you again at the same time tomorrow.
Le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a